So, we're here at SAN Conference in Italy 2017, and I'm here with Jude Currivan, who did a Master's in Physics at Oxford University and had the same thesis professor as Stephen Hawking, correct?
Effectively, yes. Dennis Sharma was Stephen's mentor and he was mine at Oxford.
Okay. And then you went on to work in business for 25 years and then I thought you had a greater calling, so you went back to academia and did a Ph.D. in archaeology.
I sort of didn't have a calling to go back to academia. I had a calling to be in service to the raising of consciousness around the world. But part of that calling involved a Ph.D. in archaeology, but researching ancient cosmologies, how people saw themselves and the world around them, because it felt that from the scientific perspective, our current cosmology was very fragmented and materialistic, and I wanted to not just take that forward, but also to research ancient cosmologies which were much more integral in terms of the perspective of people and place and the cosmos as a whole.
Okay, so my first question to you is on the nature of non-duality. Now, in my interpretation, it is a state that one can achieve, known as like the Buddhist state of nirvana, where mind and matter seem to meld into one. And there's been various other interpretations I've heard whilst at this conference. Can you possibly shed some light on this?
Well, first of all, I'd go back to when I was 4 years old, and I had my first, what I call, multidimensional experiences, which have lasted all my life, where I've literally walked between worlds in experiential sense and experienced reality as ultimately unified, although played out on many different levels. So for me, the idea of the sort of duality-based perspective, where mind somehow arises from the material brain, and consciousness is something we have, and the world is essentially materialistic and dualistic, was never melded with any of my experiences. But also that leading edge science progressively is coming more and more to that perspective. So for me, it's the appearance of the world is dualistic, but the fundamental nature of reality is unified. Mind literally is matter, matter is mind, and consciousness isn't something we have, it's what we and the whole world are.
Now with that answer, you've almost answered my second question.
Sorry!
There's an old cartoon that I remember seeing of a bunch of scientists climbing a mountain and upon reaching the top, so at the end of all their scientific research, they find a yogi at the top meditating who has beaten them to it. Do you think this is a reasonable metaphor for how science seems to be catching up to and uncovering what was already known in many ancient cultures and yogic and even shamanic cultures?
To some degree, yes. I mean, when we look back, for example, at the Vedic tradition of ancient India, we have some amazing insights of the deeper fundamental nature of reality. The Bhagavad Gitas, the Upanishads, and that perspective of unified reality from which the perceived, the appearance of the physical world emerges. I think one side of that, and we also perhaps look at the analogy of Plato's cave, where he says we think of as reality is just a shadow, and the reality is behind us, as it were. What I would not say, and I think that the extent of that, though, suggests that physical reality is somehow an illusion. And there's a word Maya that's often translated as illusion. For me, the physical world is real. One aspect, one realm, as it were, one level of multidimensional awareness. So I would translate Maya as more partial than illusory. So in other words, the physical realm, which we know emerges out of non-physical substrates at the very least, is part of the wholeness of reality. But I want to give science its due. When science sort of really emerged as a methodology, as an approach, with the likes of Isaac Newton, what had been spirituality had become pretty much dogmatized in religious formalism at that point. And so religious formalism was almost forbidding any deeper exploration of the nature of physical reality, let alone any other levels of reality. So science sort of came forward as a response to that. And in many ways, science has deepened our understanding of the nature of physical reality and seen outwards farther than we could ever have thought perhaps possible. But alongside that, in trying to keep separate from religion and religious perceived dogmatism, there's been a schism where science has progressively seen physical world as just the only reality, and its appearance of duality being the true, authentic nature of reality. And I think what that's driven is far wider than science. It's driven the way we behave with each other, because it's said you are separate. Consciousness is just an accident of evolution. Everything is meaningless, essentially. And that has lost, I think, the deeper perspective of the ancients. So for me now, it's more that there is an opportunity through the evidence of science coming alongside ancient and universal spiritual experiences to come together to reveal and verify, if you want the verification, of ultimately unified reality.
So I mentioned, I asked you a question at the end of your talk this morning about the standard model of particle physics and the four fundamental forces, which in consensus science they believe to be now complete. So everything in the universe can be, in a way, some sort of algorithm or equation based on only those two models. Do you think that consciousness can be derived from those alone?
I don't think consciousness can be derived from those alone. I think they can be derived from consciousness. And what I've done is in my new book, The Cosmic Hologram, Information at the Centre of Creation. I've actually shown how, beginning with the laws of thermodynamics, can be restated. It doesn't need a new mathematical formalism, just restated in terms of information. And of course, consciousness, if I use a metaphor, if consciousness is the music, then information are the notes of that music. We can express through our technologies anything in terms of information, and our digitized information of our technologies is exactly the same as the universal information that leading edge science, not just physics, but across many, many fields of research, is showing is more fundamental than energy, matter and space-time. And so when we restate the laws of thermodynamics as laws of information, we also find a way along the way of showing a very simple description of quantum theory and a very simple description of relativity theory. So we're showing that information expresses energy matter, which is quantum theory, and information expressed entropically as space-time, which is relativity theory, are naturally complementary to each other. I think it's a nonsense to say that mainstream physics thinks it's got a unified theory, because it still doesn't really know what dark matter is, it still doesn't really know what dark energy it is. Visible energy matter is 4%, the rest is 96%. Standard model is an empirical build-up. It's not a framework that then, families of entities fall out. It's a build-up of it. And there's a lot of gaps in it. So I think and of course, the elephant in the room is it doesn't as yet, but it is beginning to perceive the importance of information as being more fundamental, and of course thereby ignores completely the elephant in the room of consciousness. So I think we come from consciousness to the algorithms of physics as being informational, instructional algorithms enabling our universe to exist and evolve, rather than trying to go the other way.
Now, you mentioned you went to a few lectures by Roger Penrose. I was fortunate to meet him and Stuart Hameroff last year, and I asked the most far-out, outrageous question, which was based on Kabbalah. Now, in the Kabbalah, it states that consciousness emanates, it dances at the edge between two realms. Now, in my interpretation, I saw that as a mirror image of the holographic universe theory, where a greater level of reality exists being encoded in a two-dimensional plane on the boundary of the physical universe, where bits of information are stored at the quantum, the Planck scale.
The Planck scale, yeah.
Now,
which is pretty much what I'm saying, and very much where the evidence is leading. So that is why I call the book The Cosmic Hologram, information at the centre of creation, because it begins from, first of all, it takes all the evidence, all the available evidence, not just through physics, across physics, but across many other fields of research, and at all scales of our universe. And it begins by showing just how ephemeral what we call physicality is, and showing the evidence both as a theoretical framework but as an experimentally proven that information is as physically real as anything we call, subatomic entities. So there is a major convergence that's really gathering pace now to show that information is more fundamental. And then you play that with cosmological discoveries over the last few years, and you play that with the holographic principle and the coding at Bekenstein level and the Planck scale of information, and you get a very comprehensive perspective of how consciousness co-creates, a finite universe of which we are microcosmic co-creators.
Now, it makes perfect sense to me that consciousness emanates from that holographic, two-dimensional store of information on the boundary of the universe. Roger Penrose was not so much a fan of that, but he said that there are scientists that are very serious about it. Stuart Hameroff was all over it, and he said that it could be that consciousness emanates from that level of reality, but there's several interfaces between there and this one.
Absolutely, and we, that's very clear that it's a woolly blanket. As it were, the holographic boundary is very much a woolly blanket in terms of dimensional aspects. And I would say it's not just storage, it's dynamic. One of the things that you come to when you restate the second law of thermodynamics as a second law of information with entropy, information entropy is the informational content of a system, is that you come to a point where space must expand to enable our universe to evolve and time to flow. So that's the whole entropic process. And so what you get is a dynamic, evolving universe where what we call physical reality is an emergent phenomena. Energy, matter, space-time is an emergent phenomena of a dynamic consciousness, essentially of a universe, or a universe soul, existing and exploring itself, its innate intelligence, exploring and observing itself. Because of course the other piece of this is Bell's theorem requirement for quantum theory and quantum mechanics to actually operate, is that the whole universe is non-locally connected. So it exists and evolves as a unified entity, but within space-time there is this individuation and the evolutionary processes enabling the universe to observe itself, but holographically be manifest at all these different scales of experience.
So something that I haven't quite got to grips with the holographic universe theory, when you have, say, two particles or objects interacting in the physical domain, say the space and time orientation, is that in any way related to the space orientation on the 2D boundary, or is all that information encoded? So it doesn't matter where on the surface of the membrane they are, in order to interact, that information in itself is also encoded.
Well, it's not an either or. I mean, they're innately oneness, essentially. It's just the appearance we can simplify it, but we can oversimplify it. Space expands so that the number of Planck scale areas on its holographic boundary or brane expands, which enables more informational content, more information entropy to be expressed within space-time. So, essentially, there's a pixel or many pixels, because obviously the Planck scale is minute compared to quantum entities. The excitation, influential aspects of quantum entities, the Planck scale is so much tinier. So what we've got is a position, perhaps, a space-time, not spatial, but a space-time point on the expanding holographic bound of the physical universe, where those two particles are, combining and coming together, whatever. But the whole of our universe is experiencing. So it's almost as though a balloon's being blown up, yeah? So all the information within the appearance of the 3Dness of that balloon is encoded on the boundary. It just appears to be within it, yeah?
My other question is going back to Roger Penrose. Now, I've been a big fan of their theory of orchestrated objective reduction, which is a quantum theory of consciousness. But there's one thing that I struggle to understand. Now, Roger is very fixated on gravity being at play at the quantum level. So when you have qubits formed from the tubulin in the microtubules that are present in every neuron in your brain, they can exist in two possible forms and a superposition of both forms, and each form curves space-time in the opposite direction, and the collapse of this is what consciousness emanates from. Now, in my opinion, gravity is such a weak force. How can it possibly be at play in the neurons in the brain?
Well, I'm not sure it is, and I'm not very familiar with their postulate. But what I would say is that I think more theorists are coming to the perspective that gravity is an informationally entropic emergence. Because if you think about it, going back very simply to Newton, force equals ma, mass times acceleration. And gravity is in that sense, force of gravity equals g m1 m2 over r squared, okay? Einstein understood that acceleration and gravity are the same. And if you look at what correlates them, it's the second derivative of time. In other words, if you apply force to something, it will accelerate till you stop applying that force, when it will just continue as a velocity, okay? A velocity of a sense doesn't have any time effect. Velocity doesn't matter whether it doesn't have. It's a steady state. It has no notion of a past and a present and a future. But force does. Acceleration does. Because if you're applying an acceleration, then that acceleration will be less a moment before than it is now and it is going forward. So for our entire universe, we have a situation where our universe is going forward all the time. Okay? So my postulate is one of the things coming out of restating the laws of thermodynamics as laws of information and resolving quantum theory and relativity theory along the way as complementary expressions, is that you can start to consider gravity as an informationally entropic force, which of course is what people like Eric Verlinde are doing. But the other thing that comes out of this is that for our universe to be informationally entropic, space, the expansion of space cannot be at a constant velocity. The expansion of space is predicted by what I'm saying to either be accelerating or decelerating. So we know from what I'm calling the Big Breath rather than the Big Bang, 13.8 billion years ago, that our universe began by space accelerating and then decelerating, and then 5 billion years ago to accelerate again. So there's been no time, as far as we have evidence of cosmologically at the moment, where our universe's expansion of space was going at a velocity. It was always accelerating, decelerating, accelerating. And that is a prediction of what I'm saying. Because otherwise, what is I'm saying about the informationally entropic nature, not just of gravity, but of any forces, is the past has less informational entropy than the present, has less information entropy in the future.
Thank you. I want to touch base on consciousness. Now, there's been so many documented cases of terminal lucidity, where 5 to 8% of Alzheimer's sufferers in the week or a few days before they pass away, they're in a vegetative state. Their brain has undergone up to 50% decay, like huge vacuoles where there's no grey matter, and then they reach a stage where they regain full cognitive faculties, and they call up their loved ones or friends and tell them they love them and goodbye. And there's also been other cases where people have been missing huge chunks of their brain, like lacking a whole cerebellum, which contains 79% of the neurons in the brain. And there was one case of a girl that was a physicist, had an IQ of 120, and she had almost no brain, just a thin film of grey matter touching her cranium. In a way, surely this is somewhat pointing towards non-local consciousness.
Of course. And not just that, but all the evidence of near-death experiences.
Premonitions.
And all the supernormal phenomena. It's interesting. I'm working with a lot of neurophysicists and neuroscientists at the moment, and neurosurgeons at the moment, who have got to the point where they've got that mind is matter and matter is mind. Because a friend of mine, Eben Alexander, who was a neurosurgeon, and folks would come to him with all their experiences of near-death, and he'd poo-poo them, because his whole belief system was nonsense. And then he had one himself, and he's very open about this. And suddenly he realised that these folks have been telling them legitimate experiences. And there's a lot of experimental evidence now on all of this, and I do write about it in my new book. But within what I'm calling the cosmic hologram, as everything is consciousness, and our universe is a co-creative construct, a finite thought form, if you like, in cosmic mind, infinite and eternal cosmic mind, then, as I say, consciousness isn't something we have, it's what we and the whole world are. So our consciousness is not in any way limited to our bodily perceptions. And in fact, our entire body is intelligent in that respect. Our heart system has a greater neuronal network than our brains does. Our intelligence is disseminated. In a way, our bodies, of course, if the whole of our reality is holographic, then our bodies are too. They are templates of awareness. And so in this sense, it makes eminent sense within this cosmology, but it makes no sense at all in a reductionist, dualistic, consciousness is just an accident of evolution, it just arises somehow from the brain. There's a great neurosurgeon called Henry Marshall, I think, in the UK. And he was interviewed very recently by one of the Sunday papers. And he said, folks talk about the problem of how mind arises from matter. It's not a problem for me. Mind is matter. And matter is mind.
It seems like it could be quite easy to get carried away with ideas in Gnosticism of this physical reality being an illusion, a creation, a construct of the demiurge, etc., and holographic universe theory, and also what we touched on before, simulation theory. And you pointed out the danger of simulation theory.
Absolutely. I find simulation... You see, for simulation theory, most folks who support it are technologists. And they have realised that the same digitised information that we can describe any object in terms of within our technologies is exactly the same as universal information, which is more fundamental than energy, matter, space-time. But then they go on to purport that therefore everything we call reality is a simulation of an advanced culture. So they don't bring in consciousness. They don't bring in that level of self-awareness and those experiential perspectives. They're just taking a sort of very linear, if digitised information is the basis of our technologies and digitised information is the basic stuff of our universe, then everything here is a simulation. The reason that's dangerous is, as I say, first of all, in my view, is first of all that it completely excludes any discussion, understanding, experiential awareness of consciousness. But secondly, for kids who look to these guys as their heroes, who look to technology as the great wow, there have been suicides where kids have said, end of the game, end of the simulation, reset.
Yeah, even Elon Musk said it's more than likely we live in a simulation.
Exactly, and Elon is a great technologist, but I would suggest that there is a much, much bigger, more empowering, deeper, bigger perspective than this, and I would love him to at least be able to consider that, because I feel it's much more empowering for him as an individual, but also for him as an influencer with many others. And I'm not asking him, or would never ask anyone, to say or do anything they don't feel authentic, but I would encourage him to consider this much bigger picture of the nature of reality.
Now for my final question, in my research on mental health, the psychology and neurology aspect, I touch upon shamanism. Now in many shamanic cultures, they tend to shun the material reality and Western materialistic medicine in favor of transcendental realms and healing spirits that they encounter in these non-physical realms. Now, I can't remember who quoted this, but it was in a recent scientific paper in Nature, and he said that consensus science has made serious attempts to preserve a material reality, but they've produced no new physics, and we need to let go of materialism to progress as a species.
Absolutely. I completely agree, and that's what my book's all about. And it's taking the sort of physics, and physicists will hate this term, but into metaphysics, because unless we expand the understanding of physics, which is all about the physical world, quantum scientists and relativists and everyone who studies complexity theory realizes that to explain what we call physicality requires a non-physical realm from which the physical reality emerges. So we have these sort of strange attractors, we have the complex plane or phase space. All physicality can only be mathematically understood, physically understood in terms of emergence from that. So we know that. It's not very often talked about, but we know that. The point is that, so the materialistic approach is really fallacious, is just mistaken, but it's a story that most people buy into because it's the story that most scientists hitherto have told. And part of that, I think, is that science is at an existential point. Because the whole methodology of science is that we are separate, so I as a scientist can observe you, and we know that that's completely wrong at the scale of the quantum, but we also know that it's actually wrong at macrocosmic scale, macroscopic scales. So science is really has a dilemma, because its whole methodology of perceiving separation and materialism is being overtaken by the evidence that's been there for a long time, but the ever increasing and ever more compelling evidence that's showing up. So that's one big point. The other big point is that science has tried very hard in the mainstream to exclude the elephant in the room, which is the nature of consciousness. And so evident, explorations into consciousness, explorations into supernormal phenomena, explorations into things like we're discussing about near-death experiences and the rest of it have been pushed to the side as much as they could be. But rather like at the end of the 19th century, where hot ovens were the precursor to the quantum revolution, then I would say that all of this compelling evidence and apparent anomalies is just pointing the way to a bigger understanding of the nature of reality. And I would never say it's an illusion, because that's dishonouring our experience as human beings. That's dishonouring the gorgeousness of our beloved planetary home. That's ignoring and dishonouring the amazing, exquisite way in which our universe exists and evolves as a unified entity, as a thought form within, the mind of the cosmos.
One tiny little addition. I've asked everyone before about their thoughts on the ego. Do you want to give your 2 cents worth? Is the ego the enemy?
No.
Like Dr. Naram said last week, he's an Ayurvedic doctor. Or as Tim Frigg said, the ego is our spiritual companion and critical to reaching the highest states of consciousness, enlightenment.
My sense is that everything is purposeful. Einstein once said you can treat either everything as a miracle or nothing as a miracle. For me, everything is purposeful. Cosmic mind didn't set up our universe, ourselves as microcosmic co-creators, all we call reality. Everything that I've experienced, everything that I've researched, everything that I've studied shows me that, there's nothing wasted. There's nothing wasted. So why would an ego somehow be an enemy or a waste or a mistake in that way? For me, when we incarnate as spiritual beings, as microcosms of consciousness into human form, why is that? Why is the appearance of duality? Why isn't there just the complete appearance of unity? If unity is the most fundamental nature of reality, why is there this appearance of duality? And the message I got many, many, many years ago was God can't know itself. Consciousness can't know itself. If everything is undifferentiated, there can be no perceiving, there can be no experiencing, there can be no exploring, there can be no evolving. So the appearance of duality is the appearance of duality, which is actually a differentiation of unity, is crucial to experiencing and exploring and evolving. So in that sense, the appearance, the differentiation of us as individuated beings, to enable us to look at each other, to experience each other, and not just us, of course, but the whole, appearance of physical reality, is crucial. And so our ego's job, in my perspective, is to do a pretty powerful, convincing role of persuading us that we are separate, because if it didn't, we would almost waste that incarnation experience of learning from each other, of playing together, of dancing together, of loving each other, doing all the things. The problem is it's done so good a role, so great a role, that in many cases we've forgotten that that's just its role. And so when we begin to understand that, instead of being sort of method actors, where the ego convinces us that this is all there is actually remember that we are actors, divine actors, having a human experience, and therefore allowing the ego to play a role. So not to be ego-less, but to be free of its insistence that this is the only reality. So in a way, instead of it being in the driving seat, trying to keep us safe in a dualistic world, as it would perceive it, is to actually say, it's okay, really honour you, really appreciate you, but now my heart's helping me remember the oneness and come along for the ride, enjoy the ride. We're not going to leave you behind, we're not going to leave you by the roadside, but just get comfortable in the passenger seat.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome.